In this video, we'll be looking at features of Plait relating to reviews and observations. Some of these features are new, others have been recently updated in response to user feedback. To provide a comprehensive overview, I'll be covering both new and existing functionality. In addition to a standard home care event with 1 or 2 care workers visiting 1 or occasionally 2 service users, Plait now supports 3 additional categories of event. Service user reviews, or simply service reviews, involve a senior staff member visiting a service user or their advocate in his or her home to discuss their current care delivery arrangements, their ongoing needs, and desired outcomes. Care worker reviews, often known as supervisions, involve a care manager or care worker team lead meeting with a care worker to discuss aspects of their employment, such as current workload, training requirements, disciplinary matters, and so on. Observations occur during a scheduled care event, providing a care manager or other senior staff member with the opportunity to observe a care worker as they perform their scheduled duties. As this is a very commonly used term, I will be referring to care worker reviews as supervisions for the remainder of this video. This is, however, customizable. If your organization uses another term for care worker reviews, you can visit the UI tab of the organization page and enter your chosen terminology here. As with any other category of event, you will need to set up suitable event types before it will be possible to begin scheduling supervisions or service user reviews. For service user reviews, make sure that Has Service User and Has Staff have been selected. For supervisions, make sure that Has Care Worker and Has Staff have been selected. If your organization performs more than one type of service review or supervision, perhaps with different frequencies, then you should define more than one event type for each. For example, perhaps you have a one-off supervision to exchange feedback with newly employed care workers and a one-off welcome review for new service users. As observations take place during a standard home care visit, they do not require their own event type. Once you have set up your review event types, the next step is to configure how frequently you require each of these to be performed. This is done from your organization's Reviews tab. Under Default Service User Review Requirements, add an item for each of the event types that you have set up for service user reviews. In each case, specify the number of days, weeks, or months after a service user's initial contract has begun that you will require their first review of this type to have been completed by. For ongoing review types, you should also specify the number of days, weeks, or months between successive occurrences of this type. I have already defined the expected frequency for my service review type. Let's set up Welcome Review as needing to occur within 1 week of service commencement. As this will be a one-off requirement, I will leave Ongoing Deadline blank. On the care worker side, I have already defined the required frequencies for my ongoing supervision type. Let's do the same for New Recruit supervisions. Observations work a little differently. As we have already discussed, you don't need to set up dedicated event types for observations because they take place during regular care events. However, you are likely to have a number of different things that need to be observed, and it won't necessarily be possible to observe all of these during the same event. Indeed, it might not be necessary to observe some things as regularly as others. To manage these variables, we have introduced the concept of observation scope. Each observation scope defines one particular thing that you wish to observe your care workers doing. For example, you may have one observation scope for logging into and out of events, one for COVID safe practices, one for med delivery, one for lifting and handling, and so on. Use this Add button to define the observation scopes relevant to your organization. Let's set up an observation scope called Topical Med Application for the application of medicinal creams and so on. As with supervision types, we are required to specify how many days, weeks, or months after the care worker's employment commences before their first observation with this scope should have taken place. Perhaps you require topical med application to have been observed within the first 6 weeks of a care worker's employment. The ongoing deadline defines the maximum allowable time between successive observations with this scope. Perhaps topical med application should be observed at least once every 6 months. Each time an observation is scheduled, the list of scopes that are expected or hoped to be observed will need to be selected. By ticking Select by default here, this observation scope will be selected by default each time a new observation is scheduled. This is just a planning shortcut, and there will be an opportunity to deselect scopes which cannot, or could not, for whatever reason, be observed. The remaining options on this dialog allow you to impose restrictions on the attributes of an event where this scope can be observed. For example, observations of lifting and handling will presumably require a multi-care worker event. Observations of personal care duties might require the event to be matched to a care planning task session with at least one personal care task due to be performed, and observations relating to med administration are likely to require the event to be matched to a med session with at least one med, be that topical or non-topical, due to be administered. I'll click here to indicate that topical meds are a requirement for this particular observation scope. The training requirements list enables you to specify any qualifications that your staff are required to have before performing an observation of this scope. When assigning a staff member to a scheduled observation, only those people holding a qualification of the specified types will be considered as potential assignees. The drop-down here will contain all of the training types that have been defined against your organisation and all ancestor organisations. Add more than one item to the list to specify additional requirements. Equivalents can be specified alongside. To set up a rule for this or this, let's set up medicinal creams as a required training type for our new observation scope. As we've now seen, when defining observation scopes and requirements for service user reviews and supervisions, we are required to specify a mandatory first deadline and an optional ongoing deadline in each case. For care workers and service users joining your organisation after these requirements have been set up, the first deadline will be calculated from the start of their initial contract. For care workers and service users who already have active contracts at the point of a new requirement being added, the deadlines won't apply from the date of their initial contract, as, in many cases, this will already have passed. Instead, the first deadline will be calculated from the day when the requirement is added. Before we leave this tab, a quick comment about inheritance. The three lists on this tab, observation scopes, default service user review requirements, and default supervision requirements, all inherit items from ancestor organizations. This means that you can set up a list of business-wide requirements against your parent organization, and then, if you have child organizations to cater for particular service specialisms, you can add additional scopes and requirements relevant to those specialisms against those organizations. You may be wondering why these two lists have the word default in their heading. The reason is that all of the first and ongoing deadlines specified from this tab will apply by default to all service users and all care workers from the corresponding organisation and all child organisations. But any requirements that may exist for more frequent observation or review can be specified on a per care worker or per service user basis as required. Let's take a look at Will Kane, one of DemoCare's care workers. Notice that Will has his own reviews tab, and here his own observation requirements and supervision requirements. All of the observation scopes defined against Will's organisation and all ancestor organisations will be listed here alongside their default deadlines. Where necessary, we can enforce more regular observation by reducing the number of days, weeks or months specified against the relevant scopes, and similarly more regular supervision by reducing the ongoing deadline here. Remember, the organisation defaults can only be overridden with more frequent observation or supervision requirements. Against each scope, this observations field summarises the number of historical observations with that scope, when the next observation, if any, has been scheduled for, and what the deadline is for completing that observation. The same information is provided for supervisions by this events field. If we take a look at Catherine Earnshaw, one of the service users from DemoCare, we'll see a very similar picture. Here on the Service User Reviews tab, the organisation defaults are shown, but, where required, more frequent requirements can be imposed by reducing the deadlines here. Of course, needing to visit the Reviews tab of individual service users and care workers to keep on top of scheduling requirements for reviews and observations would be very time consuming. The bigger picture is provided by two new matrices, where you'll be able to see, with red-green color coding, who has upcoming deadlines. We'll take a look at these matrices later. First, let's take a look at the day-to-day process of scheduling reviews and observations. Scheduling a new service user review is as simple as adding a new event to the service user's calendar, selecting the appropriate event type, and then allocating an available staff member. If you know which staff member will be carrying out the review, type the first few letters of their name into the box provided. To search for an available staff member, taking into account their office hours availability, other events they may already have been assigned to, and any training requirements that might apply to this type of event, type ? Into the staff box. I'll select myself in this case, and then save this new event. Reviews are shown on all relevant calendars using the color chosen for the corresponding event type. In the corner, a white speech bubble is shown. Hovering over this icon reminds us that this is a planned service user review. Although the date of the review is in the past, it is still considered to be planned because, as yet, we have no evidence of it having taken place. This is confirmed over on the Service User Reviews tab. Below Service Review, we are told that the first review has no outcomes recorded and, as yet, no follow-on review has been scheduled. Clicking here will expand upon this summarized information. This red tick indicates a past event for which no outcomes have yet been recorded. So how exactly do we record outcomes for a completed review? For care events, outcomes can be recorded by the relevant care worker or care workers in the form of an event log. But the use of Plait Mobile is currently reserved only for care workers, so how is the completion of a review verified? The answer is simple. The relevant staff member simply records the outcomes of the review into a field provided here. Once the review outcomes have been recorded, this event is now considered to have taken place. A green tick is shown in the speech bubble here. And if we refer back to the Reviews tab, we can see that the red tick has now turned green, indicating the verified completion of this review. This white circle indicates that the next review is unscheduled and that we still have at least 2 weeks before the deadline. The circle will turn orange when there is less than 2 weeks remaining and red when there is less than 1 week remaining. Now outcomes have been recorded for Eileen's first service review. This might be a convenient time to schedule her next review. Let's return to Eileen's calendar and jump forward to week commencing October 31st. I'll schedule Eileen's next service review for 10 a.m. As this is several weeks from now, there is no need to assign the staff member yet. For now, the review will be treated as an unallocated event. If I fail to allocate someone closer to the time, it will be subject to an unallocated visit alert. If we take one final look at Eileen's Reviews tab, we see that the service review that I have just scheduled for October 31st appears here. This red dot indicates that it is currently unallocated. Although the date of this review is several weeks from now, Plait is assuming that it will take place as scheduled and is showing the next deadline 12 weeks from that date. Scheduling and recording outcomes for care worker supervisions is done exactly the same way as for service reviews. As he has very recently begun working for DemoCare, let's schedule a new recruit supervision for Will Kane tomorrow by drawing an event onto his calendar, selecting the appropriate event type, and assigning an available staff member to carry out this review. As with service reviews, supervisions are distinguished from care events by the appearance of the speech bubble here. Over on Will's Reviews tab, we can see that the newly scheduled event satisfies the deadline for Will's new recruit supervision. This green circle indicates that the event is planned for a future date. Notice that there is no follow-on deadline shown. This is because new recruit supervisions occur only once for each care worker. The supervision requirement has no ongoing deadline. Returning to the planned supervision, notice how there is no review outcomes field here. This is because the planned date for the review is in the future. Let's take a look next at the process for scheduling and recording outcomes for observations. As we've already discussed, observations take place during regular care events. To nominate an event as one where observations will take place, click on this magnifying glass icon alongside the care worker's name and then tick Planned Observation. We are now provided with a list of all observation scopes from the relevant care workers organisation and all ancestor organisations. Here we can define the scope of this observation. What are we planning to observe? Scopes that use the Select by Default option will be ticked for us automatically. Depending upon the parameters of this event, it may not be possible for all scopes to be observed. Those which, according to the current plan, cannot be observed will be greyed out. Hover the mouse over any of the greyed out checkboxes for an explanation. Here we can see that at least 2 care workers are required for it to be possible to observe lifting and handling. Notice how lifting and handling checkbox becomes enabled when I add a second carer allocation to the event. You can right-click and select all or deselect all at any time. You may have noticed that when I ticked the planned observation box alongside Will's name, this staff field was revealed. Here we can nominate a staff member to perform the observation. As with reviews, we can leave this field blank, although if we do so, as can be seen when I save changes to the event now, it is considered to be unallocated and will therefore be subject to an unallocated visit alert. Notice how the event where the observation will take place is identified on calendars by this magnifying glass. As with reviews, on the basis that we have no evidence that the observation has actually taken place, it is shown as planned. If we take a look on Will's Reviews tab, we can see that the observation we have just scheduled is listed as having no outcomes recorded against those scopes which we planned to observe: logging in, logging out, med delivery, and so on. Those scopes that we could not or chose not to select are still showing as unplanned. This red circle indicates that the scheduled observation is unallocated. Let's rectify that now. Back on Will's calendar, we'll double-click on Monday's scheduled observation. Notice how the magnifying glass is now flashing alongside Will's name. This is to alert us to the fact that there is a planned observation, but the details are currently hidden. To reveal details of the planned observation, we can click on the flashing icon. I'm going to assign myself to this observation now, which, as with reviews, I can do either by typing in the first few letters of my name or by typing in a question mark and then selecting myself from the list of available staff members provided. Upon saving this change, we'll see that the event is now considered to be allocated again. Back on the Reviews tab, this is confirmed by the fact that the red circle previously seen here has been replaced by this red tick, indicating that the planned time of the observation is in the past, but no outcomes have yet been recorded. Before we can record any outcomes for an observation, the care worker who is due to be observed needs to have arrived. Generally, this will be recorded by the care worker themselves, touching into the event using Plait Mobile, but for the sake of this demonstration, I will manually record the login by selecting this option. To begin recording outcomes for this observation, I'm going to open it full screen. Notice how, when opening an event full screen like this, the planned observation details are expanded by default. This is simply because there is more space available. I can hide these details, should I want to, by clicking here. Observation outcomes are recorded on a scope-by-scope basis by clicking on the relevant scope description and then typing in my notes into the box provided. Notice how I'm only provided with links for those scopes that were selected during planning of this observation. However, now we have proceeded beyond the planning stage, I am able to tick any additional scopes that I may have observed and untick any that I was not able to observe on the day. Even scopes that couldn't previously be selected can now be ticked or unticked. Let's record outcomes for my observations of logging in, logging out, and COVID-safe practices. These green ticks are shown alongside the scope description as my outcomes are recorded, and those outcomes can be reviewed, modified, or expanded upon at any time by clicking on the corresponding link again. For now, I'm going to leave med delivery ticked, but not record an outcome for this scope. If we return to Will's calendar, notice that the observation is still identified as planned. This is because I have failed to record an outcome for all of the selected observation scopes. To rectify this, I should either record the outcomes of my observation of med delivery, or alternatively, if I was unable to observe Will delivering meds on this particular occasion, deselect the scope. Notice how a green tick appeared inside the magnifying glass here when I deselected med delivery. This is to recognize that the observation outcomes are now fully recorded, a fact that can also be seen from the calendar by the appearance of a green tick here. If we take a look at Will's Reviews tab again, we can see that there is now a green tick against the first observation of logging in, logging out, and COVID-safe practices. All of these scopes have now been observed once, and the next deadline for observing them has been calculated for us. As logging in and logging out need only be observed every 12 months, the next deadline for an observation with these scopes is next year. COVID-safe practice requires observation every 3 months, so the next deadline here is much sooner. The observation of Will that we have just recorded outcomes for took place during an event for Catherine Earnshaw. So as not to unduly disturb her routine, we should probably avoid scheduling additional observations during Catherine's other upcoming events. Plait can help you to avoid overburdening service users with observations by allowing observation limits to be defined. If an observation is scheduled that would exceed the limit that applies to the relevant service user, a warning will be displayed. To set an organization-wide limit for all service users, visit the Organization Reviews tab. Tick this box and then choose the maximum number of observations and the period over which this limit should apply. This limit can also be overridden on a per-service user basis. To do this, visit the Reviews tab for the relevant service user, tick this box, and then specify the relevant personal limit. Entering a value of 0 here will indicate that observations should never be scheduled during this service user's events, but let's set Catherine's limit to 1 observation each week. On Catherine's calendar, the observation that we scheduled earlier is shown, and if I attempt to schedule a second observation during one of Catherine's events later in the same week, this warning will be shown. Although the Reviews tab on the Service User and Care Worker pages provides a rich breakdown of an individual's recent and future reviews and observations, it would be very time-consuming to regularly visit this tab for every active Service User and Care Worker in order to stay on top of deadlines. Instead, for organization-wide management of reviews, supervisions, and observations, we recommend using 2 new matrices that are provided as options from the Organization Context menu. Before I show you how these matrices work, let's take a look at 3 new fields that are relevant to them on the Organization Reviews tab: Observation Planning Window, Service User Review Planning Window, and Supervision Planning Window. These 3 fields are important because they control how color coding will be used on the matrices that we are about to look at in order to bring to your attention tasks that you should be thinking about performing now. To be able to decide what values to enter for these fields, you need to consider how long it can take for a suitable time to be found for an observation or review to take place, to find an available staff member to allocate to that event, and to provide notice to all of the other people who will take part. Depending upon how busy your schedules are and what your care manager's workloads look like, it might be easy to schedule in a review given just a few days' notice. Or perhaps much longer is required. If it can take 3 weeks to find a suitable time and staff member to complete a review and to provide the required notice to the relevant service user or care worker, enter 3 weeks as your service user planning window and your supervision planning window. Any deadlines that are less than 3 weeks from now will begin showing in an increasingly dark shade of red on the relevant matrix. Let's take a look at the service user review matrix now by selecting this option from the Organization menu. The Service User Reviews matrix has 1 row for each service user from your organization and all child organizations, and it has 1 column for each review type that you have given a required frequency to on the Organization Reviews tab. Color coding is used to identify how soon before the next review of the corresponding type needs to be scheduled for the corresponding service user. If we hover the mouse over any colored cell, we can see what the deadline actually is. Notice how the next service review deadline for Catherine Earnshaw is at the end of October, whilst all of the other service users have an August deadline. Of course, this is because we scheduled a service review for Catherine earlier. If you want to be able to see all of the deadlines without needing to hover the mouse over cells on the matrix, you can disable the compact mode. The equivalent matrix for care workers is a little more complicated because it combines information about both observations and supervisions. Here we see a bold heading for supervisions with columns alongside this for each supervision type. Next, there is a bold heading for observations, and alongside that, one column for each observation scope from this organisation and all child organisations. Most of our care workers have not had a new recruit supervision yet, and one is due just a few days from now, as the red cells in this column indicate. As Will's new recruit supervision has been scheduled for later this week and there is no requirement for ongoing supervisions of this type, a tick is shown here. The observation that we recorded outcomes for earlier is the reason why a green colour appears on Will's row for the logging in, logging out and COVID-safe practices scopes. To see only those supervision types and observation scopes which require fairly immediate attention, you can click on this button at the top of the page and then select Hide Supervisions and Observation Types not requiring attention in the next 3 weeks. Alternatively, you can choose precisely which columns you wish to see by selecting or deselecting columns from the list provided. Before I wrap up, a quick mention of some new alert types that relate to reviews and observations. I've already mentioned that a review or observation that does not have an available staff member assigned to it will be treated as an unallocated event and therefore be the subject of an unallocated event alert in the days leading up to its planned start date. The other types of alert that can apply to reviews and observations are those alerting you to instances where the planned time of a review or observation has passed and yet no outcomes have yet been recorded. This is important, of course, because the absence of any recorded outcomes might suggest that the review never took place at all, which could mean that deadlines have been missed. Although outcomes are expected to be recorded at some point, the staff member who has carried out a review or observation will of course need a few days, perhaps longer, to complete their write-up. How many days after a review or observation was planned to have taken place before it will be considered missed can be defined from the User Options page. Here we can set a write-up deadline for service user reviews, supervisions and observations with a default value of 14 days in each case.